The first taste of hunger came long before the plantations. After weeks aboard the suffocating slave ships, chained, beaten, and crammed together like cargo, the surviving Africans were unloaded under the blinding colonial sun. Some were so weak they collapsed onto the soil of a new land they did not know. Their stomachs were empty, their tongues dry, and many had not eaten anything substantial for days.
Welcome to The Glorious Historian, where the silenced voices of enslaved Africans resound through time. From brutal chains to unbroken spirits, we unveil their struggles, resilience, and legacy. Subscribe now, share your thoughts below, and journey deeper into their truth. Let their voices guide your heart. Listen on.
Those who could stand were lined up and washed with cold buckets of water, scrubbed harshly to remove the stench of the sea. Local traders and plantation owners stood nearby, inspecting bodies like cattle, checking teeth, muscles, scars. The ones considered strong enough were sold immediately. The rest were left in holding pens, given only a handful of moldy rice or maize each day, barely enough to survive, let alone recover from the voyage. Among them was a young woman named Abeni, whose name meant "we asked and we got" in her native Yoruba tongue. But now her body shook with fever and hunger. Her once round face was hollow, and she had lost much of her hair during the Middle Passage. Beside her sat an old man, bones visible under skin, murmuring a prayer in a fading dialect. Neither knew what land they were in. Neither could understand the harsh words shouted around them. They would soon learn that food, even the barest amount, was no longer a human right. It was a system of control. New arrivals were given a strict food schedule. In some plantations, it meant 2 meals a day: morning mush made of ground corn and salt, evening stew of beans, sometimes with spoiled meat or turnip greens. In other places, it was once a day, always the same bowl, never enough. Those who spoke out or complained were whipped. Those who collapsed from hunger were labeled weak stock and either sold again or left to die. Abeni's first days on the plantation were blurred by hunger. Her belly ached constantly. She dug in the hard soil with blistered hands under the overseer's whip. She watched others sneak leaves or insects into their mouths when no one was looking. Hunger drove people to do things they once thought unthinkable, and worse was still to come. In the weeks that followed, Abeni came to understand something horrifying. Food was not nourishment on the plantation. It was leverage, a weapon, a bargaining chip, and it could be given or taken at the whim of a master or overseer. Rations were often used to break the spirit. If someone disobeyed, spoke their language, prayed in their way, or even slowed in the field, they might be denied food for a day or more, sometimes a week. Those who attempted to share what little they had risked the same punishment. It created a culture of fear and silence, where hunger was not just a physical ache, but a punishment for remembering who you were. Abeni saw children punished by hunger. A small boy no older than 7 cried for bread and was beaten instead. Another girl, perhaps 12, stole a handful of dried beans and was caught. Her punishment was not a beating, it was public humiliation. She was forced to watch others eat while denied food herself for 3 days. By the second day, she vomited bile and passed out. There was no mercy. Those who were pregnant or nursing received slightly larger portions, not out of care, but necessity. An underfed pregnant woman was likely to lose the baby or die. But even these larger portions were rarely enough. Abeni, though not pregnant, began trading favors for scraps, helping carry buckets for the older women, singing lullabies in the early mornings, even taking the blame for minor accidents. It was dangerous, but it meant an extra bite of boiled yam or burnt bread. Some overseers took pleasure in starvation. One in particular, a man called Master James, made a cruel game of it. On Sundays, the one day of relative rest, he would stage what he called a mercy feast. He'd toss bits of spoiled food into the dirt and watch the hungriest scramble to grab it. He laughed as grown men fought over half-rotten fruit. "Like dogs," he'd say, while sipping brandy. Yet even in this horror, there was resistance. Quiet, subtle resistance. Some women saved seeds from the spoiled corn, hiding them in folds of clothing. Others learned where wild greens grew beyond the field fences. At night, when the guards slept, Abeni and 2 others would sneak out barefoot and return with a handful of edible leaves, roots, or insects. It wasn't enough to stop the hunger, but it gave them power. A tiny shred of choice in a world where everything else had been stolen. And that was enough to keep going. The longer Abeni lived on the plantation, the more she learned the silent rules of survival. And one of them was this: sometimes you had to steal, not out of greed, out of hunger. The main kitchen, located near the big house, was forbidden territory. It was where food for the white family and their guests was prepared. Thick aromas would drift downwind: roasted meat, stewed vegetables, sweet pastries. For the enslaved, the smell was both a torture and a cruel reminder of what they were denied. Occasionally, enslaved house servants would sneak burnt crusts or meat scraps from the kitchen and pass them to the field workers. It was risky. If caught, both the giver and the receiver could be whipped, starved, or worse, but hunger pushed them to try. Abeni joined a small group that devised a system. One boy, Kofi, no older than 15, worked near the stables and would borrow leftover oats or apple peels. Another woman, Miriam, did laundry near the back of the big house and would grab food waste left behind by careless children. Abeni's role was distraction. She'd fake a fall, knock over a tool, or even start singing loudly if an overseer came near. They became a quiet, desperate team. One evening, Kofi brought a prize, half of a cold biscuit. It was the largest portion any of them had seen in days. They split it carefully, each savoring the bite like gold. Abeni closed her eyes while chewing, imagining home. Her mother's cooking, the aroma of yams, the salted goat meat they had only on holidays. That dream shattered when Kofi was caught 2 days later. An overseer found a stolen turnip in his pocket. The punishment was swift and brutal. Kofi was tied to a post and whipped in front of everyone. His back tore open with each strike. The others were forced to watch in silence, hands clenched, teeth grinding. Abeni cried quietly, guilt burning in her chest. After the beating, Kofi was denied food for a week. He survived, barely. But the message was clear: stealing would not be tolerated. Hunger might kill you slowly. Defiance would kill you quickly. Still, some refused to give up. Miriam managed to sneak dried corn kernels hidden in her hair wrap. Abeni learned how to crush certain leaves into a bitter paste that quieted the ache in the belly, if only for a few hours. They shared what they could. In the worst moments, Abeni would whisper her father's old proverb: "A tree grows even if the sun forgets to rise." It reminded her that survival, no matter how painful, was a form of rebellion. Among the enslaved women, the hunger hit differently. It was not just a gnawing emptiness, it was a constant threat to their unborn children, to their ability to produce milk, to their capacity to simply stand and breathe. Abeni began helping one of the older women, Mama Gina, a midwife born in bondage. Gina carried a small leather pouch with dried roots and bitter herbs, medicine she claimed had been passed down from her grandmother in Dahomey. "A starving mother births a ghost," she once whispered to Abeni. "No soul wants to live in a belly that cries." Pregnant women received slightly better portions, but only when their labor was near. Most were still expected to work in the fields until days, sometimes hours, before delivery. If they collapsed, they were dragged to the shade. If they lost the child, they were blamed. Abeni watched one woman, a Beba, bend to pick cotton with swollen ankles and sunken eyes. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. That afternoon, her water broke in the field, and she gave birth under a tree, surrounded by flies and dirt. The child didn't cry. No one helped her until sundown. Later, when Abeni brought Abeba a damp cloth and a spoonful of water, she whispered, "He's gone." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes were dry. Hunger had drained even her grief. Mama Gina said stillbirths were common in times of famine. "But still, they blame us," she muttered one night. "Say we're cursed. Say we don't know how to be mothers." Abeni began collecting wild plants with Gina to brew teas that could help women keep their strength. At least, what little strength there was to be found. They used bitter bark, mashed leaves, and chewed clay. It was a thin line between medicine and poison, and sometimes women got sicker. But there were no other choice. Nursing mothers fared little better. Milk dried up fast in empty bellies. Babies wailed night after night, their mouths clamped on breasts that gave nothing. Some women tried to feed infants mashed roots. Others chewed food and passed it from their mouths to the babies. When rations were delivered, mothers always fed their children first, even if that meant starving themselves. One night, Abeni found Miriam crouched in the corner of the women's cabin, trying to nurse a baby that had already passed. She rocked back and forth, humming a lullaby, unaware that the child's body was cold. Abeni knelt beside her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and whispered a prayer in her mother tongue. The silence after was heavier than hunger itself. Twice a week the rations were distributed. It was a ceremony of control disguised as sustenance. The overseer, Mr. Tillman, a tall, pale man with a hawk-like nose and boots that never touched mud, stood on the steps of the supply house. He held a leather-bound ledger and read out names as if calling roll in a school. The enslaved stood in line, silent, barefoot, heads low, waiting for their portion of cornmeal, a few beans, maybe a strip of salted pork if the shipment had arrived. Abeni always stood with the others, arms clasped in front, stomach curling in on itself. Sometimes the rations were smaller than usual. No explanation was given. Mr. Tillman would simply shrug and say, "Hard times," before handing out less than half a handful. Those who displeased him, who spoke back, missed quotas, or even looked troubled, were skipped entirely. Children were not guaranteed food. Mothers often went without just to ensure the little ones got something. Elders, too, were often forgotten in the count. It was a slow method of weeding out the weakest. One morning, Abeni heard her name called, but when she stepped forward, Mr. Tillman sneered. "You gave attitude yesterday," he said coldly. "No meal for you today." She hadn't spoken, only flinched when he slammed his whip into a barrel near her. Abini returned to the cabin empty-handed. Her stomach ached, but the shame ached deeper. Mama Gina tore off a piece of her own portion and handed it over without a word. Miriam passed her a small root she had hidden. Abeni chewed slowly, tears welling in her eyes. They were all starving, yet still found something to give. It was the kind of generosity that slavery couldn't destroy. Later that week, a child fainted in the ration line. 10-year-old Kwame collapsed face first into the dust. No one moved at first. Then, Abeni rushed to his side, cradling his tiny head. Mr. Tillman barked, "He's faking," and turned away. Kwame was carried back to the quarters. His lips were cracked, his breathing shallow. The next day, he was gone. Some said he died from heat stroke. Others whispered it was hunger. Abeni couldn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of the women's cabin, counting the cracks in the wood. The hunger didn't just eat the body, it gnawed the spirit, wore it down like river stones. She made a vow to herself. No matter the risk, she would learn to grow food in secret. Even if it meant a garden no bigger than a hand, something to feed a child, something to reclaim her dignity. Abeni began her search for seeds, not with a shovel, but with a whisper. It started with a quiet conversation beside a water barrel, then another behind the wash shed. Small exchanges with other enslaved people, each testing trust like a rope across a ravine. She learned who had once been a farmer, who had hidden a kernel or two in the lining of their clothing during the Middle Passage, who had snuck seeds from the overseer's stores under threat of flogging. One night, under a moonless sky, Abeni dug her first patch of earth. It was no bigger than a blanket, hidden behind the smokehouse where the chimney threw enough shadow to make it invisible during the day. With fingers calloused from cotton, she broke the dirt gently, as if handling a wound. Into the soil she pressed dried beans, stray corn, even seeds from the pulp of overripe gourds thrown out by the cook. She marked the rows with pebbles and prayed. Water was scarce. She saved her wash water, let it cool, then poured it drop by drop into the soil. Some days she went without drinking just to feed her crop. Mama Gina noticed and brought her broth thickened with bark. "You can't pour life into the ground if your own spirit is dry," she warned softly. Abeni nodded, but kept planting. Weeks passed. The sprouts came slow, trembling and green. Some withered in the sun, others were stolen, maybe by rats, maybe by someone too hungry to resist. She didn't ask. She planted again. The other women began helping, in quiet ways. Miriam left bits of crushed eggshell near the roots. A young boy smuggled ash from the hearth to keep insects away. No one spoke of it aloud, but they all knew. This garden was more than food. It was rebellion. It was survival with dignity. Then one day, a miracle. A gourd, plump and golden, lay in the shade like an offering. Abeni wept as she cradled it in her arms. They cooked it that night as a tin pot over low flame. The taste was nothing special, watery and bland, but it was theirs, grown in secret, eaten in freedom. For a moment, hunger stepped back, but the danger never left. If the overseer discovered the garden, there would be punishment, harsh and public. So they covered the plants with dead branches during the day. They never visited in groups. They never took too much. Caution became part of the harvest. Still, every sprout was a small victory. And in the darkness of their captivity, each seed carried the memory of a home they were never allowed to return to, and the dream of one they might build, even here. The hunger returned with a vengeance when the rains failed. Crops in the overseer's fields turned yellow and brittle. Even the hidden garden behind the smokehouse began to dry and crack. Abeni poured the last of her wash water into the soil and watched it vanish instantly. At night, the sounds in the quarters changed. The soft murmurs became restless, shifting. Children whimpered in their sleep. Stomachs growled so loudly that they seemed to echo in the beams of the cabin. Then came the whisper. "There's a rooster." One of the field hands, Josiah, had spotted it in the overseer's yard. Fat, red-combed, strutting between the woodpile and the shed. No one knew why it hadn't been eaten yet. Maybe it was being saved for the master's table. But Josiah had a plan. "It don't need to be all of us," he said quietly. "Just 2 or 3. Fast, clean, no trace." They argued. The risk was too high. Getting caught could mean lashes, or worse. But hunger is louder than fear. That night, Abeni joined Josiah and young Caleb. The moon was veiled by clouds, a blessing. They crept barefoot through the rows of sugarcane, hearts pounding like war drums. Every twig underfoot sounded like thunder. The rooster heard them before they saw it. It let out a loud, accusing crow. That shattered the silence. They froze. A lantern flared in the overseer's quarters. Doors creaked open, but Josiah moved like a shadow. He lunged, caught the bird, and twisted its neck in a single motion. No sound, no blood, just silence. They sprinted back through the cane fields and didn't stop until they were behind the cabins, gasping for breath. They didn't dare cook the bird over an open flame. Too much smell, too much smoke. Instead, they buried it in coals beneath a clay pot and packed earth over it, a method Abeni had learned from her grandmother long ago. The meat cooked slow and smoky through the night. When morning came, they dug it up, tore it apart in hushed reverence, and divided it among the children first. Abeni took only a small piece, barely a mouthful, but it tasted of triumph. No one asked where it came from, and when the overseer stormed through the quarters that afternoon, demanding answers about his missing bird, everyone looked confused. No one flinched. No one betrayed a word. That day, for the first time in weeks, laughter bubbled behind the cabins. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was real. The rooster had been a small thing, but in its defiance, it had reminded them they were still alive, still fighting, still human. Days passed after the rooster, and while no more animals disappeared, the air around the cabins changed. A quiet pride settled into their hunger, not satisfaction, but defiance. Still, hunger grew sharper again. The garden's leaves drooped with the sun's heat. The clay pot where the bird had cooked was buried again, this time not with meat, but with the memory of it. Abeni felt her strength thinning. Her feet ached worse than usual, and even lifting buckets made her dizzy. Others were worse off. Mama Gina hadn't left her cot in 2 days. Caleb's ribs stuck out so far they looked carved from wood. The desperation turned creative. They made flour from ground acorns and bark. They boiled roots from the forest edge and crushed insects between stones. Once, they scraped mold from a damp beam and brewed it into a bitter, bubbling drink they pretended was soup. Then came the bones. The dogs on the plantation ate better than the people, but sometimes they left scraps, cracked bones, half gnawed and tossed into the trash pit. Josiah was the first to climb in. He came back with an armful of greasy, blackened bones and a grin like a thief with treasure. They boiled them for hours. The broth was dark and thin, but it smelled like heaven. Abeni sucked one dry and felt the strength creep back into her arms. Mama Gina opened her eyes and whispered thanks. Even the children stopped crying for a moment, but it couldn't last. The overseer noticed things, missing bark from the trees, dogs sniffing at empty pits, weakened workers too tired to stand. He cracked his whip more often now. He walked with suspicion in his eyes. Abeni was nearly caught once. She'd wandered too close to the edge of the cane fields looking for roots and stumbled upon a surveyor. His coat was pressed, his boots polished, and his eyes cold. "What are you doing here, girl?" he snapped. She lied, said she was sent for firewood, showed her empty hands. He didn't believe her. He pushed her down. She scraped her palms on a rock, but she held her tongue and she didn't run. Running would have meant chasing. Chasing would have meant punishment. That night, Josiah helped her wash her hands. The water stung, but his touch was gentle. He said nothing, but Abeni understood. They were all one slip away from breaking. And still they scraped, boiled, and stirred. The pot was never full, but it was never completely empty either. And in that fragile space between what was taken and what they reclaimed, they kept living. The talk of food never stopped. It became their shared dream. At night, after the children slept, they whispered memories like lullabies. "Banana stew with goat meat," someone murmured. "Cassava bread, still warm," another replied. Abeni closed her eyes and imagined roasted yams, pepper soup, and honey-thick plantains. The smells weren't real, but the ache they stirred was. One morning, a rumor spread. The big house was preparing a feast. The master's daughter was getting married, and a celebration was coming. Servants ran in and out of the kitchen house with baskets and spices. Wagons arrived filled with barrels and salted meats. Sugar, corn, flour, everything they dreamed about, rolled through the plantation under watchful white eyes. The feast would not be theirs, but they would serve it. Josiah was chosen to roast meat. Abeni and Caleb were sent to clean the silver and sweep the veranda. The rest polished glass, folded linens, and laid out porcelain plates that would never hold their food. Still, they watched. They counted the roasts. They smelled the butter melting on cornbread. They saw the pies stacked on the cooling shelf and the hams dripping with honey glaze. It was torture, but it was also opportunity. Abeni saw it first, a sack of flour accidentally left behind the cookhouse. No one noticed. It sat there, white and heavy, like a gift the earth had grown overnight. She looked at Josiah. He gave her the barest nod. That night, under cover of shadow, they took it. They wrapped it in rags, smuggled it past the doghouse, and buried it in a dried-up patch of garden behind the cabins. It wasn't much, but with flour they could make something real. Over the next 2 days, they scrounged what they could. A cracked egg, a handful of dried beans, a stolen scoop of lard. Together they ground bark for spice and boiled leaves for color. They made a fire low and steady, and from it they baked. Not cakes or biscuits, just flat, thin rounds, rough and simple. But when they pulled the first hot circle of bread from the pan, Abeni held it like it was gold. She tore it gently, gave a piece to Mama Gina, to Josiah, to Caleb. It was warm, soft, and just enough. They ate slowly, without speaking, as if afraid sound would wake the nightmare again. The feast in the big house lasted 2 days. Leftovers were thrown to the pigs, but in the quarters, that flour became more than food. It became proof that even in starvation, they still had hands that could make and mouths that could share. It rained for 3 days straight. The skies cracked with thunder, and warm water poured from the heavens like judgment. The earth turned to mud. Buckets were set outside to catch drinking water, and the fires in the cook pits sputtered and died. But the rain brought more than water. It brought quiet. The overseers stayed indoors, and the white family locked themselves inside the big house, dry and dry-eyed. That left the cabins undisturbed. For the first time in weeks, no whips cracked, no orders shouted. The silence was so strange it felt like a miracle. Inside the dark cabins, people whispered stories. Abeni remembered one Mama Gina used to tell, of a river spirit who cried tears of rain when her children went hungry. She said the rain washed pain away, even if just for a day. So they told stories, shared the last crumbs of flatbread, and let the water run over their wounds like soft cloth. Then came the fire. Lightning struck the corner of the animal shed. The dry straw caught quickly, and flames climbed toward the side of the barn. Smoke curled into the sky. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos. Men shouted, children screamed, and everyone rushed with buckets. Abeni joined them, slipping barefoot through thick mud, filling and throwing, filling and throwing. Josiah climbed the shed's side to beat the roof with a wet blanket. Caleb dragged the goats free one by one. Together they saved it. They stood afterward, soaked and shivering, their skins streaked with soot and mud. Smoke still drifted, but the fire was gone. The shed stood charred but whole, and someone laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a deep, wet chuckle from Josiah's chest. It spilled out of him like it had been trapped for years. Then Caleb laughed, then Mama Gina, then Abeni, loud and wide-mouthed, almost feral. It wasn't funny. Nothing was. But they laughed anyway. Because they had held back flames, not just fire but hunger and fear, and they were still standing. That night, the cabins glowed faintly with warmth, not from full bellies, not from peace, but from something else, a different kind of survival. Abeni sat on the step of her cabin and watched the clouds drift apart. Stars peeked through for the first time in weeks. In the silence, she could almost hear drums, not real ones, but remembered rhythms from another life, another continent. She placed her hand on her belly, not because it held food, it didn't, but because it held hope. Hope that whatever was burning wouldn't consume them, that even in ash and hunger, something could be born. Spring came with no announcement, no fanfare, no celebration, just the soft green of leaves returning, tiny buds growing where bare branches had slept, and with it came change, subtle and slow. Abeni was the first to rise most mornings. She'd leave the cabin while dew still blanketed the grass and stand at the edge of the empty field, watching the sun lift fog off the earth. Her belly was growing, not visibly yet, but enough that she could feel life turning inside her. That life gave her strength. They had almost nothing, but they had tools, broken-handled hoes, rusted nails, flat stones used for pounding, and they had seeds, not given, saved. Caleb had found a sack of corn tossed aside behind the stable, half molded but salvageable. Josiah had kept dried okra pods from last season hidden in a tin under the floorboards. They planted quietly in the spaces the masters didn't care about, behind cabins, between trees, in ditches, little gardens that looked like weeds from a distance. They called them freedom roots. Abeni bent over hers each day, whispering to the soil as if her words might help the seeds grow faster. She told the earth about her unborn child, about the world she hoped it would see, about the food she wished to feed it, not stolen but earned, food from their hands. Some days were hard. The hunger didn't disappear just because green things started to grow. Rain still came too hard, or not at all. One night, Caleb collapsed from exhaustion while hauling water. Another day, a guard kicked over a sprouting row of beans, but they replanted, always, and the crops rose. They weren't enough to fill their stomachs, not yet, but enough to remind them they could create. That hunger was not stronger than hope, that even if they didn't live to see freedom, they could plant it. One evening, after burying a cracked cooking pot that had finally split beyond repair, Mama Gina said something that stuck. "A pot breaks," she said, "but the hands that fed us still move." That night, Abeni sat outside with Josiah and watched the first fireflies drift between the leaves. The cabins were quiet, lit only by flickering lamps and the soft sound of Caleb humming a prayer tune. In the dark, Josiah leaned over and whispered, "When the child comes, they'll be born in hunger, but raised in fight." Abeni smiled. She placed his hand on her stomach and nodded. "Raised in fire," she said, "but not burned." And in the belly of hunger, they had planted something larger than food, a will to survive, a root deep enough to outlive the chains.